So one of the things that that I've talked about and then we talk about when we speak about Jewish ethics is, that so much of this is aspirational, right? It's this idea of, if we could create this perfectly just world, we would be able to all of these things would all the environmental ethics, all of the how we treat other people. Many years ago, I heard Rabbi Yitz Greenberg speak. Um, and he was talking about this from obviously from a Jewish perspective, but it actually comes into play when we talk about ethics, which is really what things cost. And one of the things before he became sort of somebody who really founded a lot of interdenominational work, and he worked for Klal for many years. But his primary source of research when he was a young rabbi was the Holocaust. And he talked about sort of his experience with immersing himself in Holocaust studies while he was simultaneously raising young children. And he'd come home, from a day of research and see these children. And one of the things that he said of all of the many disturbing things that he studied, one of the things that he studied, that he learned, was why did the Nazis start using Zyklon B gas in the gas chambers? And because it took, this is so gross, it actually was a slower way of killing people, but it was cheaper. It was cheaper, and it saved, I don't know, like, pennies, right? So he said, what is the cost of, killing Jews versus, saving Jews or saving people? So if you are, let's say, a federation, what should be the cost placed on helping people? Well, the cost on it should be anything, right? Anything, right? Whatever it takes, it should be anything. But the reality is, we don't have anything or everything. I mean, when we have questions about healthcare in this country or environmental issues in this country, what things cost, how much it costs a factory to, make sure that pollutants aren't getting in the air versus what we're willing to pay for the products. None of us want to really pay a lot for products, and so we turn a blind eye to, let's say, slave labor in China, because I like going into Target and buying a t-shirt for $4. I don't really want to pay what it would cost to pay an American worker to produce, an organically cotton, ethically resourced product. So anytime that we're making decisions about ethics, the reality is that sort of that what things cost actually does, unfortunately or unfortunately, come into play. So all of these sort of aspirational ethics about how do we take care of Jews, how do we take care of non-Jews, how do we provide the environment, how do we protect the environment, are all, aspirational goals in a world of limited resources. And having said that, I think today's topic, which has no, it was cheaper than using bullets and could kill masses, which was more efficient, right? Like killing people in a gas chamber, part of the choice of killing people in a gas chamber is it was cheaper and more efficient than lining people up in pits and shooting them. And then you also had to deal with, human beings, right? The people that were killing and the people that were being killed. So it was more efficient to gather, well, okay, right? But then even like, well, what is the cost of the gas if there's a cheaper way to do it? So, what he sort of juxtaposes the idea that a Jewish life, not even to prevent people from suffering, was even worth a penny or two. In any case, I know that was a private, but in any case, with all of these things, there's nothing more, in my mind, more sort of aspirational than the topic that we're going to talk about today, which is the ethics of rebuke. that in the Jewish tradition, and we're going to look at some of the sources, that there is an understanding that we as Jews have a responsibility for, and I would say probably towards other Jews, that we have a responsibility when we see somebody doing something wrong to rebuke them. Now, this isn't what we talked about last week as far as being a bystander, where somebody's committing let's say a crime. I mean, it's very clearly when somebody's committing a crime, you're supposed to, call the police, report it. So I asked my daughter-in-law last night, who's an attorney and a Talmud scholar in her own right, and Israeli, if she knew anything about Israeli law via bystanders, and she said she didn't. And I'm like, can you get on that for me and see what you can find out? See if you can find something out for me about what modern Israeli law is. So this is different from being a bystander, and that we're talking about when somebody's committing, a crime that's harming somebody else. So but rebuking somebody that's doing something wrong, what would be an example? Let's say, what would be some examples of that that wouldn't be necessarily criminal behavior? Lynn?
I was going to say when they don't mask.
When they don't mask. Yeah.
Or
How
pull
well
up your mask.
Anybody ever have to ask somebody to put their mask on?
Or just pull it up.
Or just
a lot
pull
of
it
times
up.
it's
Well, also I learned to just point to it.
that's-
So when
yeah.
I have in my point, I point to it and I look at them.
Okay, so
Mhm.
let me ask you a question. What happens? Do you think about, do I say something? Should I say something? How am I going to say this? Have you ever had anybody not respond well? Marcia?
Yep. My neighbor,
Right.
with whom I had nice relations, came down in the elevator with no mask on to fetch a guest that I had let in. And she didn't have her mask on. I said, "Oh, you forgot your mask. Give me a break, honey."
Yeah.
That's why I don't speak.
I didn't.
That's why I just
Oh, I see
point
what
to
you're
the
saying.
mask, and
Yeah.
it's like everybody knows what you're saying.
Right.
They've been told it over and they understand they're tired of it. But some people, just like I do sometimes, I forget.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing because it's funny because I wonder if 2 years ago, I had been teaching Jewish sources on the topic of rebuking, if something so easy would have bubbled to the top. Like, what's interesting that we're living in a time where this is a really current and hot issue in a way that we might, I mean, there are other examples of this that we're going to talk about, and we can talk about that in a second. But the fact that something came to mind so easily and is so current and topical in our lives says something about the time that we're living in. And it would be an interesting question about, would you feel more comfortable, at your local grocery store going like this? What if I was in a local grocery store in Florida where I didn't feel so comfortable I did actually get into a thing with a woman at UPS because we were in a long line, but it was Florida, right? So it was a different ethos. Even though you were supposed to be wearing a mask at that point, people weren't widely vaccinated. She didn't take too well to me asking her to put on a mask, standing inside next to me, indoors with the door shut. It's so, if you were in Wisconsin, like there are certain places where maybe you would feel less comfortable. What other examples of things that might come up about rebuke? Eileen?
When I see someone litter and there's a waste bin within 3 feet of their hand.
Right. See that? One of the interesting issues that I don't deal with anymore because I never do it, and I don't know, this is probably, and I don't know if any of you have ever had this experience, but Facebook. You post something on Facebook and anybody can comment on it and say things that can be embarrassing, hurtful, call you to task. Whenever I've posted anything that I've ever written on Facebook, invariably somebody will say to me, I think you're wrong. As much as I may, Judaism may encourage an ethos of rebuke, I don't particularly like being called out for my views on Facebook. But sometimes it's really like scary and dangerous. Charlotte read me something that was so beyond depressing, but you know that there was an Israeli young man that was killed last week. Maybe you don't know, by a Hamas terrorist. Hamas took credit for it. And a Jewish journalist tweeted something about, you know, the terrible loss of the life of this blah, blah, blah. And then Charlotte read me all the commentary under it, because anybody can say anything they want. He was a soldier of a colonialist, genocidal regime. You know, this is just self-defense, you know, all the horrible, 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 horrible. So, you know, rebuke can be something that can be maybe, you know, helpful and help us grow and help us hone our thinking about things. And it can also be terrible and painful and hurtful. What about in our personal lives? And we gave a lot of examples today of what we do with people that maybe you don't know so well. It could be a stranger, even if it's somebody that lives in your building. What about family members? How do you deal with that? Or do you deal with that? Elise?
I am constantly reminding my husband to stop speeding.
So constantly means he didn't
Every
thank
time
you
we're in
once.
the car.
So he didn't say to you, Elise, thank you. I hadn't really realized I was doing that. Right. And now that you've pointed it out, I'm going to stop. So, you know, the interesting issue of rebuke is how many times do you do it? You know, do you, what happens when somebody, you've rebuked them and they aren't going to change their behavior? They're going to continue to do what it is that they want to do. You know, so that's an interesting question about rebuke. Yes, Lois.
I've had issues with my children, one in particular, where I really feel like if I don't say something about this, nobody's going to say it. And I kind of preface things like, you know, I love you, but I see a quality here that I think is very negative, and it's going to affect you personally, and that's why I'm telling you about it.
How is it received?
Well,
okay, good.
I don't know if it changes
Right,
anything, but
right. Because I sometimes have people say to me, I can't say anything to my adult children. And I try to operate under the philosophy of like, it doesn't always work, but I can say anything to them once, right? I can tell them as an adult to adult, I feel about this, or I'm worried about this, or I'm upset about this, but I don't also want to be somebody that's like haranguing them, you know, like, so I do that about certain things, like when they're home and they don't help with the dishes. But if it's something that's more maybe personal or hurtful to them. So let's look at some, does anybody else have anything want to say? No, let's look at some of the sources, what Judaism says about this and where it's sort of based on. You know, it's, listen, I saw something again on Facebook today. I have this woman that I've done some stuff with. She lives in Israel, very, very, very left wing, does a lot of work with Palestinians. And she posted a picture of her son, who's under 11, getting his first vaccine. And, you know, so several people were like, you know, so happy for you. And somebody with a very, very obvious Arab sounding name said on her Facebook post, I don't trust the vaccines and I wouldn't get one for my child. So I was thinking about that in light of knowing we were going to be talking about rebuke. And what I don't ever get into this on Facebook with people, but what I would have said or wanted to say was, why is that helpful to her now? Her kid's vaccinated. Like, do you want to just make her feel bad? Do you want to scare her? Like, why is this helpful now? Like that you feel that you need to say this publicly. So don't get your kid vaccinated. And But you know, so you know that I have had I've had a lot of wonderful meetings with congregants over the last few months, which have been wonderful. And there've been a lot of common themes that have run through all of the meetings, and almost all of them. One of the things we invariably end up talking about is people that refuse to get vaccinated. Anybody have any anti-vaxxers that are close to them? Have you tried to convince them to get a vaccine? Has it worked? Lynn, if you,
Yeah, my sister won't get
Okay.
vaccinated because it changes your DNA. So she's not going to get vaccinated. But I have a friend, and he has a wonderful phrase that I have to use. He goes, "You can't fix stupid."
stupid. So that's it, again, like we talked about masks, but it's a very interesting time to live in when you know people that you feel, that you believe, because we believe in science, that could be actually risking their lives and won't and refuse to do what, you know, what science is telling them that they should do, and putting themselves in risk and possibly putting other people in risk. So these are interesting times. So all right, so let's look at the sources. So again, that's why I said I feel like some of this stuff is super aspirational because it's hard. It's so hard to do. It's so hard to do. I find it. It's so hard to do well, either in that people don't want to listen to you, or that it can be very alienating. Lynn?
And anyways, what's the difference between rebuke and criticism?
I'm not sure that there is. So let's keep
Okay.
that question. Let's look at the sources and let's think about if there's a difference between that. So the basis for all of this, for all of Jewish law about this, is, of course, not surprisingly, a verse from the Torah. You shall not hate your fellow in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of them. You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against your fellow citizens. Rather, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So you might not know, or you might not have known, that this verse immediately precedes probably one of the most famous verses in the Torah. V'ahavta l're'echa kamocha. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So when you think about the whole idea of rebuking if I had said to you, what do you think after it says don't rebuke your neighbor, what do you think the next verse is? Probably nobody would have guessed love your neighbor as yourself. So the Torah actually has something really interesting to say and to think about the connection of rebuke and the connection with love. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen in one moment, but you shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge. So in the world of the Torah, what is the connection between loving your neighbor and bearing a grudge? How are the two connected? Marcia?
I'm thinking that, you know, the unspoken rebuke eats away at the non-rebuker. And so then you get yourself into trouble because then everything gets magnified the next time something happens, or if they keep doing it and it builds and builds out of proportion. And that would be not good. And it certainly takes you out of the realm of being able to love them and could get you into trouble.
Okay, so speaking out in this case keeps the resentment, right, from festering. I mean, probably we all have examples of this in our life with family members, probably with friends. So this is right, suggests that these are people that you know and have a relationship with, you know, your neighbor, your fellow, the people that you are living amongst, not necessarily your family, but your neighbors, your community, perhaps even your, you know, your fellow citizens. Right. I mean, this is again, a very interesting time. Maybe it's always been an interesting time. You know, I grew up, as I'm sure many of you did. There were two things you never discussed. Did anybody learn this growing up? What were the two things you never discussed?
Religion and politics.
religion and politics, right? Like maybe that was better. Like maybe it kept us from, but like I don't know why do I want to know? Why do you know? Like it especially in the last 6 years in this country. I mean, when so many people struggled with when they knew that their friends, their loved ones, or whatever voted for Trump. There were so many conversations that first Thanksgiving about how am I going to have Thanksgiving with my, with my family members that voted for Trump. It was nothing that I think any of us had ever really seen before, right? This idea of that divide. So this text would suggest that either, well, there's nothing that you should talk about your politics or your religion. Maybe it's better not to, this is more like personal grudges, right? Somebody does something that bothers you, that hurts you. I'm sure we all have people like that in our lives. And you don't say anything, and you don't say anything, and you don't say anything. And then the Torah calls this, bearing a grudge in your heart. Bureau, did you have your hand up?
I did. I just want to say that this is the first thing that we were told at the orientation meeting when we came over here, that you use deodorant and you don't talk about politics and religion. And I said, what are you talking about? Weather? And I think
Right.
really that is good to talk to people about things like this, because it opens people up. You know who you're dealing with. You
Yeah.
either stop talking about this or you continue to have a meaningful discussion,
Right.
which I had many times.
So it's an interesting question. I mean, Dan and I talk about this personally all the time. When people do something, a friend does something that hurts you, or that bothers you, do you say something? And frankly, depending on the situation, I could make a case for either side, right? Like sometimes like, just let it go, right? No good is going to come out of telling them that they really did something that, bothered you or hurt you, if you're actually the kind of person that can really let it go. But if it's something that festers, right? So you start avoiding them, you don't want to spend time with them, every time you're with them, you can't believe that they said this thing or they did this thing. The risk is you tell them and then they're mad at you. I find these things very fraught. And maybe other people don't, maybe it's easier for other people, but I find these things in personal relationships incredibly fraught. Lois?
I think we're talking about two different things here,
Okay.
because when we talk about treating your neighbor, loving your neighbor as yourself, they're talking about protecting your neighbor. Like if your neighbor is about to do something wrong, or even has done something wrong that they can correct, you're protecting your neighbor from doing wrong. And that's different from when somebody just bothers you. Maybe they don't laugh at your jokes, or I don't know. There's a difference here of level of severity here, seriousness.
Okay. Barbara?
If you love your neighbor and your neighbor loves you, in quotes, then you are inclined to think the best of each other, and perhaps you don't take it as you're not as offended. You want to give them the benefit of the doubt. A phrase that one of my aunts loves is, only people who love you can really tell you when you stink.
Wow.
And I think there's something to that also, that you can presume on friendship if the friend really knows that you care for them, and that the rebuke is coming from a different place than just hatred.
I agree with you, Barbara, but it doesn't work all the time. So people may not really understand your intentions. And I agree with you. If you don't tell me that my hair sticks out or my slip is showing off, who is going to tell me?
Right.
But you know what? I always tend to keep things open because I never know when I offended somebody without knowing that. So I always like to say, hey, let's talk it out. And then, deal with this as appropriately.
Look, I think also it really depends if like you were raised in the Midwest, where there's a certain sensibility of like, I mean, for me, it was very hard to get used to Israeli culture, where people would come up to you and say, you have a pimple on your nose. And I'm like, really? Like, there are certain cultures that are much more open about saying to you, your hair's sticking up, or your slip is showing, versus like, like there are, it could also be, there are cultural norms that are different depending on where you grow up. So let's continue with the sources. So, so yes, I mean, the verses, you shall not bear sin because of them, because you are so angry that you want to take vengeance, right? Like it's not even just that you bear a grudge and you don't want to be around them anymore and it kind of ruins the friendship, but that you could get so angry at them that you want to in some way get revenge on whatever it is that they've done. So it can escalate into something that holding these things in over time can lead to very bad behavior of wanting to not only bear a grudge, but really lash out or hurt them in some way. So the commentary continues. So this is the Rashbam, this is medieval commentary on this source. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. If someone has done bad to you, do not behave as if you continue to love them, all the time setting an ambush for them in your heart. Such an attitude is unhealthy, but rather you shall rebuke them for what they have done, and through that there shall be peace. So if somebody's done something bad to you, do not behave as if you continue to love them, all the time setting an ambush for them in your heart. Such an attitude is unhealthy, but rather you shall rebuke them for what they have done, and through there shall be peace. So what do you make of that? This is like a psychology lesson, right? This is what a medieval rabbi is telling us about psychology. Lynn?
What if there's not peace after the rebuke? I mean, I could see in a lot of ways where you have these things going on and there's not going to be peace at the end of it.
Look, it's interesting. I mean, I'm sort of, Judy, let me say, Judy, did you have your hand up? Go ahead.
Well, it sounds like a passive aggressive stance.
Right.
I think it's easy to fall into that, certainly in certain relationships, maybe not all, but there's might be certain relationships where you're just like, all right, I'm just going to go along like everything's fine. And then boom, one day it blows up. And I think that's what they're addressing here.
Right. Look, the other thing too is, I don't know, maybe I'm interpersonalizing this too much, but I have had the same really best friend since we were like 8 years old. And when you've been in a relationship with somebody for that many years, it's almost impossible, right? That you haven't done things over the years to let each other down, to disappoint each other, to make each other angry. It's sort of inevitable. She tends to be much more like, let's just get this on the table. Like, this thing happened, let's just get this on the table. Let's talk about it. And let's just and I tend to be much more like, I'm not ready to say anything. Let's just wait. You might be surprised because I think you guys see me as a person who's pretty but I'm always like a little bit more tentative, but over, a 50-year plus relationship, we have both figured out how to accommodate that, right? How to be well, just tell me what you're thinking, or, all right, this is really hard, but, and I know a lot of people, we probably all know a lot of people, and we may have had this even in our own lives, of friendships that drift apart. because you really don't know how to say anything, or friendships that end because you finally do say something. And the other person doesn't take it well. Like all of these things happen in the course of a human relationship, right? It kind of depends on, you know, this is the opposite side of rebuke, but many years ago, I wanted to do for Yom Kippur, I wanted to do a sermon on forgiveness, because obviously that's a big theme. And I thought as a cute like hook into the sermon, I would interview like a handful of people in the congregation that had very long marriages, under the sort of idea that anybody that had been married, 50 years plus had something to say about forgiveness. Because I couldn't imagine how you could be in a relationship for that long and not have had to experience that in a relationship. And so it's not surprisingly, there was a lot of advice about you need to have a short memory, you need to let things go, you need to have a sense of humor, the things that, I mean, none of it was things that you would have surprised you to hear, but I thought there was something inspirational about hearing it from people that had weathered a very long relationship. So I guess, I won't point out Elise, but the fact that she can, tell Marty to stop speeding every time they're in a car together, for all of these years, he hasn't stopped speeding, but they're still married, and like, she's still telling him what she thinks and he's still doing what he wants to do. And, wait, I'm sorry, what?
Sometimes it's not such a good day.
Right. But like, this is how these things work out somehow. I'm sorry.
My microphone is terrible. Sometimes it goes down better than others.
So, so it's so, but the idea is with the Rashbam is that if you hold all these things in, it's going to come out in unhealthy ways, right? It's going to could come out as vengeance, could come out as, disproportionate anger, that somehow in his mind, there has to be a way, a path for being able to share these things before they're blown out of proportion. So I want to look at one last source with you. So this is a midrashic source. So this is about 2,000 years old. And the phrase "by the temple service" is a means I swear. That's what it means in the context of this. So I swear by, avodah is the word in Hebrew for the temple service. So it's just like I swear to God would be maybe what people would say in more common modern parlance. So said Rabbi Tarfon, by the temple service, in this generation, there is no one who can administer rebuke. So even 2,000 years ago, they were saying, the Torah says you're supposed to do this. Here we are, the great rabbis of our generation. And I'm telling you, none of us know how to do this, which is fascinating, right? That this Torah value of you need to rebuke your neighbor, don't bear, grudge, don't take vengeance. This is how you love your neighbor as yourself. This is a hard thing to do, and there's nobody that knows to do it in the right way. In other words, there's nobody that knows how to say it, maybe in a kind or a compassionate or a productive way. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, by the temple service, in this generation, there is no one who can accept rebuke, right? So the issue is not that we don't know how to give it. The issue is that nobody knows how to receive it. Rabbi Akiva says, by the temple service in this generation, there is no one knows how to administer rebuke. So he agrees with Rabbi Tarfon that that's the real issue. And then Rabbi Yochanan, son of Nuri, says, I call heaven and earth as witness that more than 4 or 5 times was Akiva punished by Rabbi Gamliel due to me because I complained about him, yet I knew that nevertheless he increased his love toward me. So this is sort of the very often the Midrash and the Talmud would tell stories about, well, how did this actually happen? So Rabbi Yochanan says, well, guess what? Rabbi Akiva says there's no one that knows how to administer rebuke, but I several times actually administered rebuke to him. I actually went to the head of the yeshiva to complain about him, and he got punished. But he always he always loved me. In other words, there is somebody in our generation that knows how to receive rebuke, and that would be Rabbi Akiva. Now, Rabbi Akiva was the greatest, considered like the greatest rabbi of our generation. We know about him. There are lots of stories about Rabbi Akiva. He was poor. He was very, very poor. He was a shepherd. He fell in love with the daughter of his employer. She wanted to marry him. Her father was not happy. She married him. Her father disowned her. She worked her fingers to the bone so that when Akiva was 40, he could go and study. He became the great scholar of his generation. In the face of the Roman decree that Jews were forbidden from teaching Torah, he continued to teach Torah, and he was martyred by the Romans in a really horrific way. And we read about that on Yom Kippur when we read the martyrology. So he is held up as this one shining example of somebody that can receive rebuke. But we see, even as I said, 2,000 years ago, the challenge of the issue is nobody knows how to give rebuke. No, the issue is nobody knows how to receive it, or possibly both. So that's why I said this verse is sort of aspirational. Like even our ancestors didn't know really how to deal with this verse, which is so important in the Torah, but so very difficult to be able to do well and to be received well. Marcia.
It doesn't seem clear to me in the verse that Rabbi Akiva knew who had turned him in.
Right.
Right. Yes, he can accept it, but sure, he still bore love toward him because he didn't know that he had complained about it.
Perhaps it's not a great example of what we're talking about, complaining to somebody else about something that somebody did.
Right.
So it's not really doesn't fit the example of what the verse is really talking about.
But on the other hand, he accepted the rebuke from the head. Well, was that because it was the head? But on the other hand, he accepted it, and it didn't show that he was grumbling about the head.
Right. Right.
But okay.
What else? Anybody else? Yes, Barb.
I'm getting back to Vera's question about the difference between rebuke and criticism. Okay. And this class has made me think about that a little bit more. I think a rebuke is just calling someone on something that they've done. And one thing that the first rabbi that you just quoted said is something like, let he who is without sin throw the first stone. And I think that the answer from the person who's been rebuked is, well, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, that kind of thing. But criticism, I think, is sort of more forward looking. It's maybe suggesting that the person could act differently or better in the future. It's not just calling them on something they've already done. So in that sense, maybe it has more, it's a little gentler, and maybe has more to do with self-improvement rather than just being angry about a past event.
Right. But you have said something that really made me think of something that I think is interesting to contemplate. Let he who is guilty cast the first stone is from the New Testament. There is nothing in the Torah that suggests that you can't call people out on their bad behavior. And I wonder, I'm thinking about the difficulty with this. Nobody in Israel seems to have a lot of difficulty with this verse. And I'm wondering, it's a Midwestern sensibility, but I wonder how much of that is influenced by Christian culture, which has a bit of maybe a different take on how one would, would criticize or would call somebody out. And how those we talk a lot about like Judeo-Christian ethics, but they are not the same. They are really not the same. There are certain similarities, of course, because Christianity bases itself in some ways on the Torah, on what they would call the Old Testament. So of course there are similarities, but there are also really real differences. And I wonder if this is sort of an interesting example of a real difference between what does it mean to try. I mean, the thing about Judaism that I feel like we always have to remember that underpins all of this is, what does it mean to create a holy, sacred community? And so when people aren't acting in those ways, how do you, how do you tell them? And I'll tell you something that I think that's interesting, from a rabbinic point of view. I grew up like this. Maybe you guys grew up like this. But the rabbi that I grew up with, or like many of us grew, not Rabbi Frankel, Judy, so you didn't grow up like this, where the rabbi from the Bima would, speak to people about, you should be keeping Shabbat, and you should be keeping kosher, and you should be doing all of these things, which ... you should. But I didn't like that as a kid. And so I never really, my feeling is I show you how these things are so great, and maybe you'll want to start doing some of these things. I'm not sure that I have a pretty successful track record of, 30 years plus in the rabbinate, convincing people, to do anything. And part of it also could be, it's a different generation, it's a different time. But part of the idea of rebuking people is telling them, there are people that feel like it's your rabbinic responsibility to be telling people how to live more Jewish lives. Interestingly enough, it is far easier to talk to people about, you should be feeding the hungry. Like, nobody's going to say to me, oh, Rabbi, I don't think so. I don't think I should be doing that. Like in any, so, and part of that is also a Jewish Christian divide. Right? Christianity jettisoned all of that Jewish ritual. And so it's much easier to talk to Jewish people in the United States in 2021 about social justice issues. The same thing that their friends and neighbors, if they go to church, are hearing at church or wherever they're hearing it. It's easy, right? Easy. Nobody's going to say it, though, unless it's, talking about opening the border to Syrian refugees as Trump is about to be elected. There were the few Trump supporters in the congregation were not happy with that sermon, and let me know that they were not happy with that sermon. So it also depends, issues of social justice could depend a lot on the politics of the congregation in this day and age. I will say, just as an aside, I have been so overwhelmed about the response to co-sponsoring an Afghani family with Hayas on the part of the congregation. It has just been overwhelming seeing people's response to this. Very, very gratifying. So it's much harder to rebuke people about their Jewish religious observance. Just throwing that out there. I think about how you would feel about that if all of a sudden on the high holidays, I was giving sermons about why you should all be keeping kosher. But when Judaism talks about rebuking, it doesn't, unbraid the braid. It's many various behaviors that would fall under, under the umbrella of that. Vera, and then Judy.
Rabbi, I remember you broke my heart. I asked you, what is the most important things of being Jewish? And you said immediately, keeping kosher. And I thought, oh my God. what I'm going to hell or something. So it was really, I mean, I was really stricken, you know.
Curious to
But
know how old I was
appreciate
when I
it, your
said that,
honesty.
because I can't, I don't know, like, if you asked me that would have, like, that doesn't resonate with me as the first thing that I would respond to that question. But I'm, but you're rebuking me, so maybe I'm sorry if well, I don't know. It's hard to say, like, keeping kosher is really important in Judaism. It is. It's not.
I'm not rebuking you. I'm not rebuking you. I appreciate being very honest about this. That's it. But I was very upset about not being.
Right. So this is the thing. I don't know that I would say, like, I think it's hard to rank order what is the most important thing in Judaism. I mean, I think if you really ask me, what's the most important thing in Judaism, it's how you treat your fellow human being. But that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that's important in Judaism. It's also important that you follow Jewish ritual. So I might say that the most important thing is that you study Judaism, so you understand what all of these various things even mean. But if somebody was to say to me, is keeping kosher important in Judaism? The answer to that would be yes, it is. So Judy, did you have?
Yeah, I think, the rebuke, that there's a line between rebuke and being instructive. If you have a young family coming to you, the response doesn't have to be, you need to keep kosher, you need to observe Shabbat. It could be these, just like you're saying, here's the books about it. These are things that are really important to our culture, to our faith. And I can help you on that journey, versus a scolding situation. So I think some of it also depends on who's doing the rebuke and who has the ability to maybe teach and instruct for that future change.
So, I mean, I think, rebuking people from the Bema has probably fallen out of style in most congregations. It's a different time. But I will say, like, there was a rabbi who's now deceased, who did it a lot in Deerfield, and I would hear a lot about it from his congregants. But I don't know how many liberal rabbis, would use their precious Bema time, to do that. But but in Judaism, all of these things are considered, because I said you can't unbraid the braid. They're all it's all connected. It's all connected. It's all considered part of Jewish behavior. Marcia, is that a new hand up? Okay, go ahead.
I'm wondering if I'm going off in the wrong direction. The difference between rebuke and criticism. It seems like rebuke is more of a for something you've done, or the way you're acting that might describe a character flaw, whatever. But criticism, I feel, has more to do with the person. And yes, we judge by actions, but it seems as though rebuke to me is a little bit more of a standalone rather than intrinsic to the individual. That yes, rebuke can be seen as criticism, but I don't see them as the same.
Yeah. Well, I think about, oh, I'm sorry, Jody, go ahead. But you have to unmute.
Where is the line between accepting people for who they are and criticizing them, and telling them what to do? And it leads me back to a little bit of all the Christianity helping the African children because they really want them to believe in God. Sort of like, okay, we'll do this with the exchange. And how much is getting people to believe what we believe the goal versus getting along with people?
Look, the thing is just, everybody has personality quirks. So, criticizing personality quirks after a while might wear really thin. But I think the interesting question, I think part of the interesting question is somebody that's an anti-vaxxer, right? Like, are you criticizing them or are you rebuking them? Is there really a difference? Or is it like you see somebody that's doing something that's dangerous or destructive versus something that's just annoying, like, and that, and Elise used the thing about speeding. So potentially speeding could be dangerous, right? So that there might be there's a behavior that you're worried about because it could lead to somebody dangerous. But one of the conversations that I've had a lot, and maybe, let's say, somebody that, drinks too much or is an alcoholic, at what point do you have to say, after you've, expressed your worries to them multiple times, at what point is it like, I've said all I can say on this, and you can't stop somebody who's an addict, right? And so these things can play out they play out in so many real world ways. Elise?
You're making me think a lot about the difference between correcting someone to help them and judging someone to evaluate them and say, you are worse than me. You are not as smart as me. You are not as good as me. And I think there's a huge amount of difference there. And I don't see, and I think that has a lot to do with how people take the information. If they're being judged as, like my husband, like, I am a great driver, right? He is definitely a better driver than me. He is far more skillful than I am, right? It doesn't mean I like his speeding. But he sometimes takes it as me judging him. And when it's taken as a judgment, I think it feels much harsher. So I haven't really seen that in this discussion. I was wondering if there's anything about judging. And I was also thinking, and I don't know if this is New Testament, I think it is, because judge not lest you be judged.
Right. New Testament. Right.
It is New Testament, right? And but I do think that is very human reaction.
Right. I think that's why the rabbis say, like, Rabbi, there's nobody in this generation that knows how to give rebuke. And if the goal is, I'm supposed to come out of this not angry at you, right? Not angry at you, not bearing a grudge. Like, I'm supposed to come out of this not judging you, then I've got to figure out a way for you to feel that when I'm saying whatever it is that I need to say. Ina, do you want to say something? As you're using the chat.
No, I wrote you a text, a chat. I wanted to thank you. This has been a very thought-provoking session, and I really appreciate it. There are so many avenues of emotions and directions a conversation like this could go. And it's, to me, it was really a perfect time prior to the Thanksgiving holiday table. I just went to a Shabbat dinner at a rabbi's house this past Friday. And most of the people I knew and thought I knew their thought process. And most of them were very educated, professional people, physicians, etc. And the conversation about the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, which was just made the day before or so, came up, and all of a sudden this lovely Shabbat table, other than the rabbi and his wife and children, it sort of blossomed into an unbelievable setting. And I had made a comment, and the guy next to me, he had really rebuked me, actually. And as I thought about it later driving home, I thought to myself, who was he to talk to me that way? And I promised myself that eventually when I see him again, I'm going to call him out on that, because everybody to the left of me, which was far more than you know, to the right of me, were really shocked at the conversation that he was producing. Then it came out about the politics, because a physician said to this other couple, I suppose you're probably in the group that's still counting the ballots. And I mean, which was really a strong comment. So is that criticism, rebuke,
Okay, so one
or
last thing,
open
time out. This is
question?
really important. We are not in Judaism allowed to embarrass other people in public, right? So I would assume that one of the big things of rebuke is that it's done privately between the
Well,
person and the other person. You are
Yeah.
not allowed to embarrass somebody publicly. And especially, that's what's so interesting, that it's morphed today into this political conversation where you are either, you know, Attila the Hun or, you know,
Well, when
or,
I was telling my son last night, who's, you know, in his 50s, about my experience. And I said, you know, as I thought about it when we were sitting there, and I don't know why I thought this way, but I thought it was so inappropriate as being a guest in someone's home. And the platform was to have a lovely Shabbat dinner. And in that, of course, what you just said comes into play. But it was like, so was that, you know, where we in this platform of criticism, rebuking, where things can get so out of hand. But this session has been wonderful, and I
Right.
really appreciate it.
It's funny, maybe I said this is such an aspirational session as far as talking about this, but you know, we can talk about environmental ethics and try to use less plastic and be aware of like the world, and we can talk about the ethics of how we help other people. But this is real life. Like this does come, nobody doesn't have a real life example of how we express ourselves to people that disappoint us or hurt us, or are conducting in behavior that we think is dangerous, or, you know, or ill-informed, or may lead to bad consequences down the road if they can, like, this is real world stuff. Maybe that's part of what makes this topic so very difficult, because who lives in a world where we don't have to, and speak for myself about sometimes bearing grudges, right? Or acting to somebody like everything's fine when everything's not really fine. And then it affects, you know, this is really, you know, this is sort of real world stuff that we all deal with. So I hadn't thought about the fact that we're, you know, heading into Thanksgiving dinner. Hopefully some of us will be with other people. And once you're with other people, there are other issues. And the other thing I think is, and then I will just end by saying this because I need to get off, but we are also living in a time where everything is so fraught, and watching everybody line up with the Rittenhouse verdict, right? Everybody lining up and seeing what it is that they wanted to see. You know, so was this the you know, horrible case of, you know, systemic racism? Was this a case of, you know, whether you like the law in Wisconsin or not, this is what the law is, and the burden on the prosecution is really high, and it didn't meet that, you know, whatever, and so he got off? Is this a case about gun control? Is this a case about Tucker Carlson? Is this a case about, and everybody immediately, at least in the media, at least what I could see in the media, and certainly on my Facebook page, everybody saw the outcome of this as like whatever their political views were. And there was, I felt, very little nuanced conversation, but I feel like that today about everything. Hence, the topic that I have had with 90% of the congregants that I've, you know, met with, which was, how the heck did vaccines become political? How did we get to a place where whether you get a shot is who you voted for? And yet we're in this very fraught place in our country. And I will say the other overarching theme of almost everybody that I spoke to in the congregation, that this congregation shares, is what is the future of our democracy? And one of the things that I thought a lot about in this Rittenhouse case is If you are on the right and you are a Trump supporter, you believe that our elections have fraud. And if you are on the left, you believe that our courts do not dispense justice. And where does that leave us? If where you end up politically, you are, and you can't trust the police. Like, where do we end up if half the country believes that this is not to be trusted, and the other half of the country believes this is not to be trusted, and our democracy is based on our elections and our judiciary, and where does that leave us? So happy Thanksgiving while it's still a day of celebration and is yet to turn into a holiday, a day of mourning. As I started saying, I read an article that someone suggested that we should that Thanksgiving should become a national day of mourning instead of a holiday. So you know, I'm worried about this and our ability. I will say one last thing to bring it to rebuke. This is exactly what these texts are trying to prevent. Right? That we're just talking past each other and have no ability to communicate. At their core, what they're hoping for is if you can have an honest dialogue about that which is hurtful or bothering you, or you see the other person is doing is dangerous, and the other person can take that in, you can stay in a relationship with them. And unfortunately, we're living in a time where we're just, you know, we're having a really hard time doing that.
But the
And
problem,
yet, the value.
but the problem, Rabbi, is that in this environment, people call each other names. You're stupid, you're horrible, you're this and that. It's on both sides, and it's just unbearable. But what I really like about Jewish custom is that, you know, you can ask forgiveness 3 times, and then, you know, if it's not accepted, then it's over. And I liked it, and I experienced it in my life really, and it works. So yes, well, and thank you. As
All right, I'm going to have to get off. So everyone have a wonderful Thanksgiving and a happy Hanukkah. And we'll see each other hopefully. Well, next week we'll be back on Zoom. So
okay, bye.
bye.
Bye to everyone.